Thanks, Molly. Well, thanks everyone for being here, and to the folks online. Hopefully you can see me a little bit at least. The angle is not great. So for today, what we wanted to achieve, Jesse and I, is to provide a high-level overview of what's the fiscal outlook in Manitoba for 2025, really focusing on what we know from the 2024 budget and the most recent fiscal update, which was released in December. And we want to put this within a broader context of its implications for public services. These public services are something that everyone in this room is deeply connected to, and many of us work in. So we want to talk about those implications, and then place it within a broader context of the tax cuts that we've been following at the CCPA Manitoba since 2016. So how are these impacting the fiscal outlook, and how is there still a lingering effect? And then following that, we wanted to make the case for new measures to raise provincial revenue here in Manitoba. And we want to place these within a context of the changes we've seen in the income distribution in Canada since 2019, and the change in Manitoba's relative tax revenues compared to other provinces. So, what is the outlook for 2025? It's a tough one. It's a difficult one. Manitoba Finance is projecting a $1.3 billion deficit for the 2024-25 fiscal year. So this is down from $1.9 billion in the previous year, 2023-24. But there's been a large increase in the latest fiscal update. It was originally forecast at $800 million. It was then upgraded to $1.3 billion. And to put this in context, there's only one other time that Manitoba's posted or two other times that Manitoba's posted a deficit above $1 billion. That was during the financial crisis and then during COVID. So this sort of deficit is quite large. And the immediate causes or the changes that we've seen in the latest fiscal update are a $164 million reduction in revenue from Manitoba Hydro, a $112 million decrease in federal transfers, as well as additional spending on public services. And we want to highlight that this additional spending in public services is needed, and it's something that we need to see continue going forward. But the $1.3 million or billion-dollar deficit is putting stress on the capacity of the government to invest in those public services. And so the point that we want to make here is that the broader context of tax cuts since 2016 are placing this pressure on revenues in Manitoba and really curtailing the capacity the government has to reinvest in public services. So between 2016 and 2023, the revenue loss per year due to tax cuts adds up to nearly $1.6 billion. This is in 2023 dollars, so that's actually a larger figure today. And the largest category is income tax reductions, which led to a loss of over $800 million. And $500 million of these cuts or lost revenue were income tax cuts announced in budget 2023. So that was during the election, which have now been implemented fully in this budget year. And so the important point here is that these tax cuts are really squeezing the capacity to invest in public services. There's huge investments needed in public services after 8 years of austerity. We know stories from the front lines of the public sector are that people are struggling. There's still high vacancy rates. There's a huge need to increase staffing levels and address ongoing crises of recruitment and retention, climate change, a trade war, poverty and homelessness throughout our community. And so we need to be prioritizing these investments in public services. And that means we're going to need to increase revenue at the province of Manitoba. So this graph we wanted to just use to illustrate, one of the areas where there has been an increase in spending in the last budget cycle has been in healthcare. And there's recently been some publicity around what was called overspending in healthcare in the last fiscal update. But when we look at the data on where Manitoba is today relative to before the previous government came into power, Manitoba is still below the Canadian average in terms of per capita government healthcare expenditure, whereas for all of the 2000s before 2017, Manitoba was above the Canadian average, which reflects our relative size as a province. As a small province, we have fewer economies of scale, and generally to provide services, Manitoba needs to spend higher, which is the reason we have equalization payments. So again, there's been a reversal of the kind of deep austerity we've seen in healthcare or over the last 8 years, but there's still a long way to go to bring Manitoba's healthcare expenditure back up to where it needs to be. The second point that we've really been talking about consistently is the effect that these government tax cuts have had on Manitoba's own source revenue. So own source revenue is the revenue the province takes from taxation within our own provincial boundaries. So that's sales taxes, income tax, other local revenue generation. And so because of these tax cuts, Manitoba's own source revenue has now reached an all-time low since this accounting structure changed in 2006, 2007. So now our own source revenues are at just above 16%, which is the lowest that we've seen since we started tracking this. At the same time, federal transfers in Manitoba have been backfilling the cost of these tax cuts. So Manitoba has received unprecedented increases in federal transfers over the last 10 years since the Trudeau government came into office. Many of these transfers have been for increased spending on healthcare, for childcare programs, and Manitoba's federal transfers as a percent of GDP are very high, but this leaves us very vulnerable as a province to changes in the way equalization payments work or the way federal transfers are organized. So if there's a change in government, which is still potentially on the horizon in the next year, and there is a change to equalization payments, Manitoba is left in a much deeper fiscal hole than it is now. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jesse to talk about the alternatives.
Thanks, Niall, and thanks to everybody coming out today to hear about budgets. Not always, you don't wake up in the morning, it's like, oh, I want to go to have lunch and hear about the budget. But what we're here to convince you about is budgets really reflect values, right? How we spend our money is really where the rubber meets the road on whether government's communications and what they're telling you actually are being implemented in practice. And so we did see some changes in budget 2024 that we were pleased to see. So Manitoba did introduce 2 new measures to partially reverse tax cuts and raise some revenue last year. There was a really interesting reform of the education property tax relief that the PCs had put in. I'm sure many of you heard about the $1 million plus mansions that were getting tens of thousands of dollars back from this rebate program that the Conservatives introduced, which obviously was highly inequitable. We had a program that was supposed to help Manitobans with affordability that was giving the most money to the richest Manitobans. And on top of it, very profitable corporations, the owners of the Winnipeg Jets, the owners of Polo Park Mall were also getting these huge, massive tax rebates. So we were very happy to see a change to that program, which set the property tax rebate at a flat $1,500. So what that did is it increased the benefit for low value homes, so low income homeowners, and capped the benefits so those wealthy households who own those very valuable properties could not benefit from that. And the government did it in a way where it brought in, or is projected to bring in, an extra $150 million in revenue. So these are the type of changes that Niall and myself and other public policy advocates that are friendly to public services and labor have been advocating for. We know the pandemic was hard on many people. We know there's an affordability crisis for many people in Manitoba, and these are the type of things we want to see. And I'll talk a bit more about the potential for making more of these type of changes. There was a second change in last year's budget, which started to phase out the basic personal amount. So this is another tax credit that Manitobans get on their tax return, and it was increased substantially in budget 2023. This is another one of those tax credits that When you talk about it in a very simple way, it sounds like it helps low-income people, and it does give some money to low-income workers, and we're not against that, but it gives the maximum value to the people who are making the most money again, right? So we like to see things like this, phasing out of these tax credits for very high-income people who don't need extra help with affordability. So these are progressive tax measures that help reverse this erosion of revenue. But these measures really only brought back about 10% of the revenue that we lost through the Tory tax cuts, right? So we want to see more of these types of measures that are targeted. We don't want to raise taxes for working people who are struggling to make ends meet, but we do think those who are doing well can contribute more to help those who can't. And the data supports the fact that those who are better off have the capacity to do this. Corporations and people who have a lot of power and wealth in society like to pretend that we're all equally hurt by inflation, right? Inflation is this big boogeyman, and we have to tackle it at all costs. But if we look at what actually happened in the inflationary crisis that we saw and the cost of living pressure that people face, is that not all households were impacted equally, right? If we look at the top 60% of income earners in Canada, their incomes actually went up more than enough to compensate for the rising cost of living. And if we look at the wealthiest 20% of Canadians, they're doing way better than they were in 2019. It's the bottom 40% of Canadians who have been hit hard by the affordability crisis and have seen the cost of living go up more than their incomes, okay? So we talk about solving the cost of living crisis with tax cuts for the wealthy who are benefiting the most from the tax cuts that we've seen over the last 8 years. We're really not solving the problem. We're actually worsening the problem. We're giving away government revenues to people who are doing better than they were before, and we're leaving those who are worse off to fall further and further behind. And these are, these tax cuts, we can get into detail if you want in the question and answer period, but this goes for income tax cuts, this goes for the basic personal amount, this goes for the gas tax cut. These are all tax cuts that benefit high income earners more than they benefit lower income working people. Okay. So the need for revenue is clear, and Niall outlined that. We're basically facing a situation of what we call a structural deficit. This is not because of a recession that we're running a deficit. It's not part of the boom and bust cycle that we see in the economy. Because of these tax cuts, we are consistently running these large deficits, and these are, frankly, they're unsustainable in the current context. We have the Manitoba government committing to balance the budget in the first term, and despite these larger and larger deficits, the Premier has doubled down on this commitment. And if we are going to balance the budget without new revenues, there is no way that's going to happen without more austerity and cuts to public services. So if Manitoba is going to fix healthcare and invest in education and restore public services after years of cuts and austerity, we need new revenue measures in the next budget. Now, Manitoba is not a particularly high tax jurisdiction. The revenue, when we look at how much revenue we bring in from taxes compared to the size of the economy, we are 7th among provinces, and this was even before the budget 2023 tax cuts. So this is based on our research we did in the Funding Our Way report. So even before these huge tax cuts in 2023, we were 7th for revenues from taxes and fees. We were right in the middle among provinces for income tax revenue from households. We were the last in corporate tax revenue, and we're the only province to not tax the income of small businesses with a taxable income below $500,000. Okay, so there's room in Manitoba to increase taxes in a targeted way. Now, our report that we published a while back explored a number of alternatives to raise provincial revenue. There's not a lack of ideas out there. So we could start by reversing these tax cuts, which benefited high income earners the most. We can start phasing out the basic personal amount at a lower income level, say $100,000 instead of $250,000. We could look at adding a higher income tax bracket. There's other provinces who have that. We don't have that fourth tax bracket. We could delink tax brackets from inflation. We could look at taxing mansions or look at raising the land transfer tax, which hasn't been increased for decades. The corporate business tax could be increased. We could look at reversing some of the corporate tax cuts. For example, the cut to health and the health and education levy under the previous government. No shortage of ideas. And I'm sure the government has competent people in the finance department who are looking at other measures as well. What we're here today to ask you is that when you're advocating for changes in budget 2025, please also include an ask to raise revenues to pay for those asks, because there simply isn't enough right now to even maintain the status quo, never mind start to make up for the years of cuts and austerity that we saw under the previous government. Thank you for listening, and we're happy to take questions.